So we come to our last presenter on this panel, Ronald Niezen. Ronald Niezen is the Catherine A. Pearson Chair in Civil Society and Public Policy in the Faculty of Law and the Department of Anthropology at McGill University. He has a PhD from Cambridge University and has done research on Islamic reform in West Africa, justice campaigns in Aboriginal communities in northern Canada, and on the international movement of indigenous people in the United Nations. His books include The Origins of Indigenism, Human Rights and the Politics of Difference, Truth and Indignation, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Indian Residential Schools, and a co-edited volume together with Maria Sapignoli, Palaces of Hope, The Anthropology of Global Organizations, which just came out this year. As I learned from Ronald the other day, he was also a visiting fellow here in Berlin a couple of years ago at the Institute of European Ethnology. So please welcome with me Ronald Niezen.
Well, thank you, Regina. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you all for coming here. I suppose the first thing that I should say is that I am an academic, and I am going to use the podium, and I should pose no problem for the camera people. I want to talk to you, basically take a trip down memory lane and talk about my experience with repatriation efforts and working as a sort of part-time consultant for a museum when I was a faculty member, an assistant and associate professor at Harvard University. I started off as an Africanist and moved back to Canada. I'm a Canadian, and was basically unemployed. Applied for a job that I saw in the Montreal Gazette to work for the Cree Social Services, the health services in James Bay, northern Quebec. And even though I was an Africanist, basically they hired me because I was cheaper than a doctor. And I flew around to the Cree communities and established sort of another set of relationships and another area of expertise before I was hired at Harvard University. Now, at Harvard, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act had just been passed the first year that I was there. And they were looking around for experts. I don't consider myself an expert in museums, never did. But they invited me to participate in some of the efforts that they were making to reform their Native American collection. The place that they were talking about was called the Hall of the American Indian. The first thing that I suggested was they changed the name of their place of exhibit because there's more than one American Indian. But from there, it became a kind of a struggle to try to understand how museum collecting worked and how the process of repatriation was working. So I began looking more and more into how some of the artifacts were acquired in US museums, which I really wasn't familiar with before, and made that a part of a general investigation and trying to make this wider known through my writing. So one of the things that became very clear to me and to others through this process of reassessing the history of museum collections is that these objects were acquired through processes that we all find morally repugnant and appalling. They were stolen. They were taken by deception. They were some of it consisted of objects that were taken from objects. I mean, they were objects and human remains human remains that were taken from the battlefield and stripped of flesh and sent to museums. The physical anthropology in the 19th and early 20th century was oriented around the concept of race. So there was this idea that you needed to have wide samples of human remains in order to understand human racial differences. And so these human remains were acquired in this way. We have here a quote from Senator Daniel Inouye, who is a spokesperson who acted in favor of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. As a Japanese descendant, he was certainly more aware than many of America's history of settler colonialism. And so the people who were lobbying behind this act had some politicians like Senator Inouye behind their efforts. One aspect of the background to this phenomenon that I haven't really heard talked about here, because the context may be different, is that some objects were acquired as a way to assimilate Native people, Native Americans, into a wider society. In other words, the objects were taken to remove them of their culture. And one of the ways to remove them of their culture was to take away the objects that provided them with a spiritual grounding in their traditions that were passed on from generation to generation. In Canada, laws were passed forbidding potlatch ceremonies. These are ceremonies in which a chief would amass a lot of wealth and give it away extravagantly. Now this, as you can imagine, embedded a network of social relations. But the colonial powers didn't see it that way. They saw it as a primitive example of wanton giving, of not being able to hang on to anything that is worth keeping, of profligacy and waste, to use some of the terminology that was used. And so there is this contradiction, fundamental contradiction, in which these objects were coveted as art objects, as collectibles, at the same time that they were denigrated as an aspect of a culture that was disappearing, and that this disappearance was seen as being inevitable, and so removing these objects from the people to whom they belonged was seen as a way of philanthropically hastening the demise of a culture and the introduction of civilized values and virtues. One of the objects that I heard about when I first started talking to people at the Peabody Museum was the sacred pole of the Omaha, which actually had been repatriated the year that I came to Harvard University in 1989, without the sort of impetus of the legislation in NAGPRA. And you can see in the work of the anthropologists Alice Fletcher and Francis LaFlèche, who worked as a team for the Bureau of American Ethnology, that this sacred pole was recognized as representing the essential values of the Omaha people, was seen as being alive and embodying the inheritance of the ancestors. And yet, for that very reason, Fletcher and LaFlèche wanted the object to be removed. And they negotiated with the chief for its removal and being housed in the Peabody Museum. So they saw that these ceremonies connected to the articles, their relation to the autonomy of the tribe was essential, and yet for that reason, this was something that needed to be done, its removal. So with the item being returned, the great-grandson of the last chief, Yellow Smoke, received the sacred pole in 1989, and it was returned to the Omaha people. And as Robin Riddington, one of my teachers at the University of British Columbia, wrote, the Omaha, through this process, could no longer be seen as having a broken culture, or no longer be seen as a vanishing Indian tribe, but had kept themselves together as a people throughout the century that they were expected to have vanished. The Friends of the Indian, on the other hand, represented by Alice Fletcher, have vanished or been exposed as the bigots they often were. But the Omaha tribe remains. Now, there was a very important background of activism behind NAGPRA. And Maria Pearson is one of the people who led this activist movement. Her husband worked for the highways department, I think, in Iowa. And he remarked that when they were building a highway and they encountered a cemetery that had to be removed of a non-native, of a white community, everything was done very carefully. A new location was found, ceremonies were done, the community was consulted, the graves were reburied. When they came across an American Indian grave or a Native American grave, nobody consulted anybody. Boxes appeared, the bones were shipped off to museums. And she thought that something was terribly wrong with this situation. And so she consulted her senator. She basically camped outside the office. She lobbied state politicians and changed laws at the level of the state. And from there, the movement, the momentum behind the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act sort of gained. The act gained momentum in large part because of, in the United States, there were multiple leverage points of this legal struggle. There was the idea of American citizens supposedly being equal, so why this unequal treatment? Why, when bones are uncovered, do some go to be respectfully reburied and others shipped off to museums? Another was freedom of religion, the First Amendment. Treaties that were individually negotiated and signed, and then, of course, international law, human rights, and UNESCO. So the 1990 Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act has requirements for every institution that receives federal funding and in which there were remains or sacred objects of cultural patrimony that could be identified and potentially returned to the tribes, the groups to whom they belonged. So the first step that NAGRA calls for is to identify human remains and other objects kept by the facility, to try to culturally affiliate them with a present-day group or tribe or Native Hawaiian organization, which became problematic, as I'll discuss, and to repatriate them under the terms of the Act. And this all happened under the Department of the Interior's National Park Service, which facilitated this government-wide implementation of NAGPRA. So one of the first things that I uncovered when I looked at what people were talking about in meetings of the review committee, there are like thousands and thousands of pages of their minutes, not just their minutes, but transcriptions of what it is that people said in the meetings. If you want to bore yourself, if you're ever having trouble going to sleep, I have the link here at the bottom of this slide that you can look this stuff up. But one of the first things that came up was the difficulty of identifying tribes, because the tribes are federally recognized. So what happens if a group of people has claims and they're not federally recognized? How does federal recognition work? Who can actually make a claim under the Act? And you can see that they began to discuss this in the very early meetings and referred to it as a black hole. This was one black hole. This is black hole number one. The other black hole, which I don't really have a slide for, was defining objects of cultural significance, right? Religious objects and objects of significant cultural patrimony. So when a museum says this object has no real sacred significance, it's an ordinary tool, it's an object, and representatives of American tribes come to the museum and say, no, this is something that's very meaningful to us, and here's why. You have the source of a misunderstanding and something that needs to be talked through. And this is one of the things that marked this act and this effort to repatriate these objects. Another thing to consider is that it was actually kind of slow. It was painstaking work that took a long time. Some museums, as you can imagine, acted with a little bit more alacrity, shall we say, than others. They were a little bit more forthcoming in what was in their collections. So we have, 20 years after the passage of the Act, we still have 55% of the human remains and 68% of the funerary objects that are published in the notices of inventory completion. So the museums had to inventory everything that they had, which means that there was still, after 20 years, an awful lot of human remains and objects that really weren't identified yet. To date, I got this from the NAG from the website just last week. It's fairly recent. So this is the scope of this effort across the United States. It's resulted in the return of the remains of some 58,000 individuals, 1,700,000 or so funerary objects, and 9,800 sacred objects or objects of cultural patrimony that were returned to Native American tribes. So what did NAGPRA produce? I know that this slide has a lot of detail that I threw into it. But one of the things that I saw at the Peabody Museum was actually a breakdown of the divide, somewhat a breakdown of the divide between the people who worked in the museums and the people who claimed these objects as their heritage. Suddenly we had delegations of Hopis and Navajos and Lakotas and people coming in and out of the museums and talking about the objects that they were bringing back. And the museum personnel learned more about the objects through this dialogue, through this interaction, sitting down with people, than they ever would have had leaving these objects shut away in their storage facilities. So it provided a kind of a difficult and uncomfortable forum for museum personnel to be confronted with the people who laid claim to their treasured possessions that they had to, by law, give up and give into these people who were the former owners and who were taking possession of them again. It led to Native American peoples developing their own sort of museum culture and culture of patrimony. So one of the conditions for returning these objects is that the objects had to be returned to facilities that were able to maintain and house the objects and represent them. So there was the act was associated with tribal organizations funding and constructing their own museum facilities. But these were museum facilities with a difference. In most cases, they were not places that shut the objects away or that released 1% of them for view to the public where you could see them behind glass. They were more, they've been more participatory. The objects are used as they were intended to be in many cases by the communities that have repossession of them. So the tribal museum facilities were affordable, accessible, open to the public, and placed emphasis on the use of the items in public practices. In some cases, the museum personnel and the people who came to claim the objects didn't see eye to eye, and they couldn't get over their differences. I remember the museum personnel in one case of repatriating some human remains. I forget what the group was, the delegation that came, but they performed prayers and ceremonies for the bones that they were receiving and described the person as being a man in his 20s. And the museum personnel were distraught by this. And they told me, but it's a 12-year-old girl. What do we do? They kept their mouths shut and they returned the objects. They didn't see the object in the same way. The museum personnel had their scientific understanding of the object. They understood some of what they thought to be the factual background, but they had no inkling of the spiritual power of these objects and how they resonated and were meaningful to the people that were taking them and having them returned. Now, all of this background that I'm talking about in terms of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act might seem a little bit far away from the concerns that we're talking about here with Berlin housing these objects, but there is a direct relationship. There is, we call Canada and the United States and Australia, New Zealand, settler colonial societies. But the attitudes toward collecting and objects are very similar to those that I see in Germany. Something else, the news conference that I attended yesterday brought out the fact that many of the remains in the sacred objects of the Ova Herero and Nama have been sent to museums in the United States. So what we're seeing now and what's becoming clear is that there isn't just a sort of a direct line of misappropriation, of theft of human remains and cultural patrimony from colonial, from sites of colonial power to the capitals, but that there was a sort of a global trade in these objects. This is now becoming a much wider issue, and I shouldn't doubt but that the museums in the United States and elsewhere that are holding these remains that are part of the legacy of a genocidal colonial war in German Southwest Africa will similarly have to come to terms with that legacy as they did through the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Thank you for your kind attention.